Sarah Hastings walked into Brew and Bliss on a bright Monday morning, the warm shafts of sunlight painting long streaks across the bustling cafe floor. It was peak hour in downtown Manhattan, and the clamor of steaming espresso machines blended with snippets of conversation, cups clinking against saucers, and chairs scraping along the tiles. She wore a hopeful smile, clutching her small notepad close to her chest. Behind her, a tall man in a plain baseball cap and sunglasses lingered, half hidden by the daily newspaper stand. Though no one seemed to notice him, he noticed everything. Under that cap was Chris Hemsworth, famous around the world, but for now just a curious bystander in disguise. Outside, traffic roared past, and distant sirens wailed as a reminder of the city's constant rush. Inside Brew and Bliss, baristas took orders in assembly line efficiency, glancing occasionally at the digital monitors that tracked their service times. Sarah, who was deaf, stepped forward to place her order using the notepad she always carried. She had reason to be wary. Some employees at other cafes had shown reluctance to communicate properly with her. But she had a familiar glint of optimism in her eyes. She was here for a simple cup of coffee, just like any other paying customer. The man in the cap trailed her with silent interest, sensing a story about to unfold. And the moment she reached the counter, tension sparked with the very first words from the barista. Aaron, the young barista behind the counter, barely looked up from the register as Sarah approached. He was under pressure. Brew and Bliss Corporate had rolled out a new policy demanding swifter order times, and that morning he'd already been lectured by his manager, Trish, to keep the lines moving. When Sarah slid her notepad onto the counter, politely pointing at her desired drink, a simple vanilla latte, Aaron felt an immediate wave of frustration. He could already predict extra steps, more time, the possibility of some communication slip. A second line was forming, and Trish hovered nearby, arms crossed, observing him closely. Chris Hemsworth, leaning inconspicuously against a side wall, watched Aaron's expression tighten. Sarah tried to offer a friendly smile and tapped the small note reading. "One vanilla latte, please." "Extra hot." Aaron glanced at her, eyebrows raised. Instantly, he recognized she was deaf or at least unable to speak. Instead of seeking an easy alternative, like reading her note, he felt the shadow of corporate's new policy breathing down his neck. Faster service meant no special accommodations, at least in his mind. Without looking at the note any longer, he muttered, "I can't take that." "You gotta speak your order." Sarah blinked in confusion, tapping again on her notepad. Customers in the queue exchanged glances, some curious, others impatient. Chris set his newspaper aside, removing his sunglasses momentarily to get a clearer view. He had come in for a quiet coffee, disguised so as not to draw attention, but now found himself unable to tear his eyes away. The woman's face fell when Aaron repeated in a more irritated tone, "If you can't say it, I can't understand it." Some in line began murmuring. People pulled out phones, unsure whether this was a misunderstanding or outright discrimination. Chris felt his chest tighten. He knew from that single exchange that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something was very wrong. Sarah politely pointed again to the note, trying to keep calm and muster a gentle smile. She was used to the occasional awkwardness when ordering, but outright refusal was rare. Her eyes darted to the manager, Trish, who stood observing with a stern look. If Sarah could have heard the shifting weight of the crowd, she would have sensed the tension thickening, every second ticking by in oppressive silence. Aaron's refusal to read the notepad triggered the first wave of conflict. He felt justified, certain that corporate push for speed meant no lengthy back and forth. But it was more than efficiency. Personal prejudice clouded his attitude. Perhaps it was ignorance, or a sense of annoyance that he'd have to deviate from his routine for someone with special needs. Either way, Sarah was left with no real recourse. The manager, Trish, stepped in, her professional smile a tight line. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, glancing at Aaron but glaring at Sarah as if she were the inconvenience. Sarah, uncertain how to respond, pointed at her note again, lips trying to form silent words that she knew Trish couldn't hear. Trish shot a glance at the lines forming behind her. "Look," Trish said flatly, "we don't have a policy that supports your method of ordering. If you're going to hold up the line, maybe come back another time with someone who can help you communicate." The words fell like a hammer. A few customers gasped. Several took out their phones to record. Chris, blending into the background, could barely restrain himself from stepping forward. He decided to wait to see if any of the other customers would speak up first. But everyone looked unsure, as though they couldn't decide if it was their place to intervene. Some shot sympathetic glances at Sarah. Others scrolled mindlessly on their phones, hoping to avoid involvement. Sarah, her cheeks flushing red, attempted to scribble a quick message on her notepad. "This is how I order everywhere. I'm deaf, I just want a latte." She held it out to Trish, but the manager waved it away. "I'm sorry, but we have a line," Trish repeated, her tone sharp. Aaron, relieved to shift blame onto management, rang up the next customer behind Sarah, ignoring her completely. The hush in the cafe was replaced by a surge of angry whispers, with a few calling out the barista's rudeness. Chris's gaze shifted from Sarah's trembling hand, holding the notepad, to Trish's resolute expression. Anger sparked in him. The line moved around Sarah as if she were invisible. Embarrassed and close to tears, she stepped away from the counter. Just then, Chris took a few steps forward, adjusting his cap. He considered revealing who he was, using his status to force a resolution. But something in him hesitated. Was that the right move, or would that overshadow the real issue? He decided to approach Sarah quietly, the hush of the cafe punctuating every footstep. Onlookers watched with interest. The tall man in plain clothes, face partially hidden, reached for Sarah's notepad and gently pointed at the scribbled order. His eyes found hers, and he offered a small nod of empathy. "Let me see if I can help," he said softly, though she couldn't hear his words. She recognized his kind expression, the sense of understanding in his eyes. He flipped to a fresh page in her notepad and wrote, "I'll order for you. I can try." She smiled in relief, nodding quickly. Chris turned and approached the counter, the tension in the air still palpable. Trish was in mid-sentence with another customer, but Chris placed a firm hand on the counter. Aaron glanced up, then froze at the sight of Chris's broad frame. The disguised actor said simply, "I'd like 1 extra hot vanilla latte for the lady you just refused." "Please." Aaron's face twisted. "We're in the middle of an order, sir. You'll have to wait your turn." The next customer, a middle-aged man in a suit, looked startled. But Chris refused to back down. He locked eyes with Trish, a subtle intensity in his stare that suggested he wasn't an ordinary bystander. "I'm paying for it, right now," Chris repeated. He set a $20 bill on the counter. "Keep the change." "Just prepare her drink." Trish sniffed, unimpressed. "We have policies to follow, sir. That includes how orders are placed. Our system doesn't allow for complicated scenarios." She avoided saying the word deaf, as though it itself were an accusation. "And I have a line of customers who order in the normal manner. If you'd like to help her, maybe you can find a place that accommodates special requests." Chris bristled at the phrase *special requests. He could sense the ignorance, even cruelty, behind these words. Another barista across the station, an older woman named Gail, watched the exchange with troubled eyes. She worked at Brew and Bliss for years and was appalled at what she was witnessing. But given Trish's position, Gail felt powerless to intervene. The corporate environment had grown more rigid under new management directives. The entire staff had been warned that if they couldn't keep order times under a certain limit, their hours might be cut. "Is the policy that you don't serve people with disabilities?" Chris asked, raising his voice slightly so more customers could hear. Several turned their heads. A murmur of agreement ran through the waiting line. Others, too, were baffled that the cafe was refusing a polite customer for no valid reason. Sarah stood a few steps behind Chris, eyes downcast, but she sensed the shift in support around her. Trish's cheeks reddened. She shot a glare at Chris, then at the phone's now recording. "That is not what I said," she snapped. "But if you can't follow our ordering procedure, I have the right to refuse service." At that moment, a security guard stationed by the door stepped forward, his posture tense. He eyed Chris as if prepared to remove him from the establishment. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, mirroring Trish's earlier words. The hush in the crowd grew thick, anticipation crackling like electricity. Chris inhaled, already picturing the scene if he was forcibly removed. Yet a deeper moral instinct tugged at him. He might be recognized, which would complicate everything, but he couldn't walk away. Not when this was so obviously wrong. In that heated standoff, a shaky hand rose among the customers. A young woman in a hoodie, her name was Lucy, spoke up. "I'll help," she said. "I know a bit of sign language, maybe I can." Trish cut her off. "This doesn't concern you." Lucy shrank back, face reddening, but glared at the manager in defiance. More phones were lifted to capture the moment. Chris noticed that, in an era of social media, these kinds of incidents never stayed private for long. He realized that whether or not he unmasked himself, the footage could go viral in an instant. He wrote another note in Sarah's notepad, letting her know people were recording. She gave him a small nod, uncertain if that would help or hurt her. Finally, Chris slid his credit card onto the counter. He had used a plain, unassuming card with no flashy name or design. "If your policy is to take my money and make me a coffee, do it. Now." Though he tried to keep his tone level, his frustration seeped through. He resisted revealing his identity, not wanting the manager's apology to be spurred by celebrity alone. But he was ready to stand his ground. Trish glanced at the security guard who asked, "Ma'am, do you want me to remove him?" The manager paused, eyes shifting between Chris, the pressing crowd, and Aaron. With the store abuzz, refusing this request a second time would spark immediate backlash. She exhaled sharply. "Fine," she muttered to Aaron, nodding toward the espresso machine. "Make the coffee. But after this, you," she pointed at Chris, "need to leave, and you," she pointed at Sarah, "need to leave with him." Aaron hurriedly began to make the latte, all the while shooting Sarah disdainful looks. Sarah kept her gaze lowered, feeling a mix of relief that she'd at least get her drink and shame at the indignities she'd faced. Chris clenched his jaw, counting the moments until this ordeal ended, uncertain how else to fight back. Little did he know that, with the cameras rolling, a viral storm was brewing online, one that would soon shed light on deeper injustices at Brew and Bliss. After they received the latte, Chris gently handed it to Sarah, who offered a grateful smile. It had cost him double what it normally would, but that hardly mattered. He touched her arm lightly, guiding her away from the counter so they could speak, through writing in a quieter corner. The security guard loomed nearby, ensuring they headed for the exit. Chris wrote on the notepad, "I'm sorry you went through that." "Are you okay?" she nodded, writing back. "Thank you for helping me. This isn't the first time, but it's never been so hostile." While they communicated, Lucy, the young bystander who knew some sign language, approached timidly. She tapped Sarah's shoulder and signed, "Are you all right?" Sarah brightened at the chance to communicate more fluidly. Lucy's signing wasn't perfect, but enough to convey genuine sympathy. Chris looked on, heartened to see that not everyone here was callous. Then Lucy turned to him and said quietly, "I wish I'd stepped in sooner. That was just horrible." Chris nodded. "Better late than never," he said in a low voice. Lucy hesitated, scanning his face. "You look familiar," she remarked, squinting as if she were trying to recall where she'd seen him before. He forced a tight smile. "I get that a lot," he replied, pulling his cap lower. He didn't want the conversation to shift to his identity. "Anyway, thanks for trying to help." Sarah quickly wrote another note, addressing Chris. "I have a friend who's a lawyer, specializing in disability rights. I might reach out to them, should I?" Chris read the note and felt a surge of conviction. "Yes," he said aloud, nodding so she'd see his affirmation. He took the pen and added, "Definitely. This kind of discrimination can't go unchecked. The security guard shuffled closer, clearing his throat. "Folks, I need you to exit," he said, voice tinged with discomfort. Perhaps even he felt a bit uneasy about forcibly removing a deaf customer who had just been refused service. Chris placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. Together, with Lucy at their side, they left Brew and Bliss. Outside on the sidewalk, the city traffic felt especially loud. People in suits hustled past, casting only brief glances at the small group. Lucy shot them an apologetic look and said she had to get to class. She gave Sarah a final pat on the shoulder, signing, "Take care," before disappearing into the crowd. Sarah tapped her phone. Chris realized she was asking if he had a number or some way to keep in touch. He scribbled on the notepad, "I'll give you my email. Let's keep each other updated." She nodded, passing him her phone so he could punch in the address. He hesitated. Should he use his real email or a burner account? Ultimately, he decided to trust her. After all, she was the victim here, and trust felt more important than secrecy. Once they parted, Chris found himself standing alone on the bustling sidewalk, heart still pounding. He could have let the moment pass, pretended it was none of his business, but it felt impossible to ignore. He replayed the manager's sneer in his mind, and the barista's hostile refusal. The worst part was that no one seemed to think it was a big deal, other than a handful of concerned bystanders. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He'd witnessed discrimination before, but never this blatant, never so personal. By that evening, Chris was back in his modest, rented apartment. He had chosen a nondescript place in Manhattan while shooting a low-profile project. This arrangement allowed him to move around the city without being instantly recognized. After dinner, he checked his phone. Dozens of messages from family, friends, and publicists usually littered his inbox, but he ignored those for a moment, scrolling through social media. And there it was, footage of the Brew and Bliss incident, recorded from multiple angles, posted by several users. One of them had racked up thousands of views in just a few hours. Comments poured in beneath the video, some expressing outrage at the cafe's behavior, others spinning into hateful or dismissive rhetoric. The internet's usual swirl of extremes. He recognized Lucy's partial cameo on one angle, the back of his own figure in another, face partially hidden but still somewhat recognizable if someone paused the footage. The video had been captioned, "Barista denies deaf woman service at Brew and Bliss, crowd tries to help." Chris's name wasn't mentioned, but in one clip, a single commenter speculated, "Could that be Chris Hemsworth in the cap?" The possibility lingered, but it hadn't exploded yet. A ping alerted him to an email. It was from Sarah Hastings. She'd found Wi-Fi somewhere and typed out a brief but heartfelt thank you. The email read, "Thank you for standing up for me. I spoke to my lawyer friend, Celia. She wants to know if you'd be willing to share your account of what happened, maybe even testify if we file a complaint." "I understand if that's too much." Chris exhaled. Testifying might mean revealing who he was, but the alternative, staying silent, felt complicit in letting Brew and Bliss maintain their discriminatory attitude. He typed back quickly, "I'm willing to help. Let me know the details. We should meet." Then he paused and added, "Thank you for speaking up." "You deserve better." 3 days later, he found himself in a quiet conference room on the 15th floor of a brick office building in Midtown. Sarah greeted him warmly. In a more relaxed setting, she looked relieved, though still upset by the memory of what had happened. Her lawyer friend, Celia Morgan, was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s. She specialized in disability rights cases and had already begun drafting a complaint. She recognized Chris the instant he walked in, but to his relief, she didn't make a fuss. Sarah had presumably briefed her that he preferred discretion. Once they settled, Celia explained the plan. "We want to file a formal complaint with the city's Commission on Human Rights, and if necessary, a lawsuit. The cafe's refusal to serve Sarah is a clear violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. However, we need statements from witnesses. We already have phone footage, but your in-person testimony would be invaluable. Chris nodded, glancing at Sarah, who sat quietly but followed the conversation by reading Celia's lips. Celia paused occasionally to sign or write a short note for Sarah's clarity. I'm happy to help. I just don't want this to become a media circus about me. The focus should remain on Sarah and the problem with the cafe's policy. We'll keep you as an anonymous witness as long as possible, Celia promised. But if Brew and Bliss fights back aggressively, they might subpoena full identities. We have to be prepared. Sarah wrote a quick note. If you don't want to be named, I understand, but your testimony could change everything. Her eyes shone with gratitude, and Chris felt a wave of responsibility. He nodded. I'll do it, he said simply, and from that moment there was no turning back. Over the next few weeks, news of the Brew and Bliss incident spread. Disability advocates rallied around the video, calling for boycotts of the cafe chain if they didn't respond. Bloggers picked it up, outraged that such blatant discrimination could occur in modern-day Manhattan. Brew and Bliss, a mid-sized chain with several locations around the city, tried to push back. Their first public statement denied any wrongdoing, claiming that the video didn't show the whole context and that the customer was being disruptive. But the blowback only intensified. More stories surfaced from customers who had been refused service or treated poorly by certain staff. Little by little, the chain's name became synonymous with neglecting customers with disabilities. In the midst of this uproar, Chris quietly prepared for a meeting with Brew and Bliss's corporate legal team. Celia had arranged a preliminary mediation session where each side would present their perspective before deciding whether to proceed to court. Sarah would attend, along with her lawyer, Chris, as a potential witness. The tension simmered. Meanwhile, inside Brew and Bliss's headquarters, the manager Trish and barista Aaron faced scrutiny from higher-ups. They both insisted they were just following the store's policy on streamlined service. Internal emails were unearthed, showing that the corporate office had sent memos urging staff to reduce overhead by limiting time-consuming requests. While the memos didn't explicitly mention refusing deaf or disabled customers, they led to a culture where employees felt pressured to dismiss anything that might slow down their metrics. That was the hidden agenda fueling their actions, and now it was about to be laid bare. In a glass-walled boardroom near the top of a sleek skyscraper, Brew and Bliss's CEO, a polished woman named Michaela Porter, sat behind a long table. She was flanked by corporate lawyers in crisp suits. On the other side, Celia guided Sarah into the room, helping her find a seat across from the CEO. Chris, wearing an understated blazer and a serious expression, walked in last. He kept his cap on, though that did little to hide his famous features up close. Michaela's eyes widened slightly. There was no question she recognized him. He saw the calculation in her gaze. This was bigger than just a routine legal complaint now. One of Michaela's lawyers cleared his throat. We appreciate everyone coming here to discuss a resolution, he began, in a practiced, soothing tone. We want to make it clear that Brew and Bliss values all our customers. This unfortunate misunderstanding. Celia cut him off. Misunderstanding. Your employees explicitly refused service to a deaf customer who was quietly trying to place an order. We have video footage, witness statements, and corporate memos that show a pattern of neglect and a focus on speed over basic accessibility. The lawyer forced a thin smile. We dispute that interpretation. The employees in question claim the customer was uncooperative and refused to follow standard ordering procedures. Sarah's cheeks reddened at the blatant falsehood. She hastily wrote on her pad, I had my order written down. That is a standard method for me. I can't speak. Chris, exasperated, leaned forward. She was not uncooperative, he said calmly. She was refused service because she's deaf. I was there. I tried to pay for her drink and they still hesitated. They only made it after public pressure. And then they forced both of us to leave. Michaela, the CEO, attempted a conciliatory smile. Mr. Hemsworth, she began, voice gentle but strategic, We understand you may have perceived the situation that way, but we have to consider the stress our staff were under. We have a strict time quota, and they might have felt it was impossible to accommodate special requests in a high-volume store. Chris felt his pulse quicken. So, it's the store's official stance that deaf people have to bring a translator, or else you won't serve them. She raised her hands as if to say not exactly. We're willing to adjust some of our policies, offer staff training maybe. We'll consider installing digital kiosks. She threw out these ideas in a measured, almost dismissive way, as if it were just an inconvenient PR problem. But we don't feel monetary damages or a public apology are necessary. We believe the matter can be resolved quietly. Celia's lips formed a tight line. She turned to Sarah, who gave a short, determined nod. Then Celia looked back at the table of executives and said, quietly, "That's not acceptable to my client. We demand a formal apology, specific policy changes regarding accessibility, and compensation for emotional distress. If you're unwilling, we'll proceed to litigation." A moment of silence. Chris watched Michaela's eyes flick back and forth. She was weighing the potential cost of a public lawsuit, the social media outrage, and the involvement of a high-profile celebrity. He almost felt sorry for her, seeing the corner she was backed into. But he reminded himself that her employees had singled out Sarah and humiliated her in front of everyone. This was no mere misunderstanding. Finally, Michaela spoke, choosing her words carefully. "Let's not be hasty. Perhaps we can negotiate something beneficial for all parties. If we were to consider a direct settlement." Sarah wrote on her notepad, sliding it across the table. "This is about dignity, not money." Celia read it aloud, letting the words hang in the stillness of the boardroom. Chris felt a swell of admiration for Sarah. Even in this intimidating corporate environment, she maintained her resolve. She just wanted Brew and Bliss to do the right thing. The mediation ended in a stalemate, with the corporate side requesting more time to review. Celia gathered her papers, nodded politely at the lawyers, and led Sarah out, Chris following close behind. In the hallway, Celia sighed. "They'll try to drag this out, hoping it dies down. We'll keep pushing." "Meanwhile, keep your guard up." She gave Chris a meaningful look. "Once the press figures out you're involved, this will escalate." Sure enough, by the next morning, a popular celebrity gossip site picked up on the rumor that ChrisHemsworth had been the one intervening at Brew and Bliss. A blurry still shot from one of the cafe videos circulated alongside speculation that it was him. People zoomed in on his face, matched it with known photographs, and concluded it was definitely him. Suddenly, hashtags like Brew and Bliss scandal and ChrisHemsworth v. Discrimination trended. The public pressure on Brew and Bliss skyrocketed. But not everyone was supportive. Trolls on social media claimed the video was staged, or that Sarah was faking the extent of her disability. Others believed Chris was using this for publicity. Yet the overwhelming majority decried the chain's behavior and demanded accountability. The local news covered it, interviewing passersby about whether they'd support a boycott. Brew and Bliss's profits began to take a hit as the negative press mounted. All the while, Sarah tried to go about her life. She still needed coffee in the morning, groceries from the store, to run errands like everyone else. Yet she found herself recognized more often, especially by those who were part of the deaf community or who had followed her story online. Some gave her a thumbs up or a wave of solidarity. Others asked for interviews or statements. It was exhausting, and she confided to Chris via email that she worried about a future court case. She wrote, "I don't want my life to become a spectacle, but I don't want them to get away with it either." Chris reassured her that they were in this together. Meanwhile, Celia continued to compile evidence, tracking down other Brew and Bliss customers who had stories of denial or poor treatment. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that the store's official policy wasn't explicitly discriminatory, but the internal culture, fueled by management's emphasis on speed and profit, led to widespread disregard for customers with special needs. Trish, the manager, was just one example of many who had enforced this unspoken rule. The entire system reeked of corners cut and ethics sacrificed for the sake of corporate metrics. Behind the scenes, Chris began formulating his own plan. He wanted to do more than just help with the lawsuit. He had resources, connections, and a genuine desire to see real change happen. Recalling how the staff had refused service until he paid extra and faced them down, he realized money could be a catalyst, but only if applied properly. He needed a bold move, something that Brew and Bliss couldn't ignore or dismiss as mere PR. So he quietly reached out to an advocacy group focusing on DeafRights, offering a substantial donation that would fund campaigns for awareness and staff training across the city's cafe and restaurant industry. If Brew and Bliss was going to operate in ignorance, they'd soon find themselves surrounded by a wave of more enlightened competitors. That internal tension exploded one morning when Chris received a phone call from an unknown number. He picked up, and a familiar voice, Trish, spoke on the other end. The manager, who had been at the center of the fiasco, had obtained his number through some unscrupulous means. Her voice quivered with anger and fear. "Listen, you," she began. "I need to talk to you. You don't know what you're doing." Chris furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" Trish took a shaky breath. "They're about to fire me. Corporate is making me the scapegoat for all of this. Aaron, too. They're saying we acted on our own. But I have proof that Brew and Bliss Corporate encouraged us to limit service to customers who slowed us down. Emails, text messages, you name it." She paused. "If you keep pushing, they'll toss me under the bus completely. But maybe we can work something out." Chris felt a chill. This was bigger than a single store manager's poor judgment. Work out what exactly? She hesitated. "If you talk to Sarah or that lawyer, maybe you can get me some leniency. I'll hand over everything I have." Enough to nail Brew and Bliss for a citywide pattern of discrimination. But I can't let them ruin my life while the CEO walks away clean. Chris realized the hidden agenda was about to be fully exposed. This was the break Celia needed. "All right," he said carefully. "Send me the evidence, and I'll make sure Celia sees it, but I'm not promising your personal outcome. That depends on you telling the truth." Trish exhaled a shaky sound. "Fine, I'll send it. Don't leave me hanging." The line clicked. Moments later, Chris's phone buzzed, an email notification popping up with attachments. He opened them to find a series of incriminating memos and email chains, each referencing undesirable customers and time-wasting scenarios, instructing managers to handle them quickly or redirect them. One even said, if they can't place an order verbally in under 1 minute, suggest they come back later or use an app. It was blatant. Chris had to reread them to believe how callous the language was. The system was corrupt from the top down. He immediately forwarded everything to Celia, adding a note, "Game changer." Then he sat back, heart pounding. The stakes had just escalated drastically. Brew and Bliss wouldn't be able to brush this off as an isolated incident. And if Trish testified, it would blow the entire operation open. By the next morning, Celia had integrated these new documents into her legal strategy. She filed motions to subpoena additional Brew and Bliss communications and pressed for an immediate hearing. The brand's internal wrongdoing, once rumor, now had hard evidence behind it. Local media latched onto the story with renewed fervor. News anchors debated the ethics of prioritizing speed over basic human decency, while social media users called for a mass boycott. Brew and Bliss shares, publicly traded, plummeted. Within days, the corporate board of Brew and Bliss forced an emergency meeting. Michaela Porter, the CEO, found herself in a precarious position. Pressure mounted from both investors and the court of public opinion. The city's Commission on Human Rights opened a formal investigation, which could lead to hefty fines or worse. In this swirling storm, the stage was set for a final confrontation, a high-stakes hearing that would determine not only the fate of the chain, but whether Sarah's cause, championed by Chris, would usher in real change for all. On the morning of the hearing, a throng of journalists and concerned citizens gathered outside the marble steps of the municipal courthouse. Camera flashes punctuated the gray sky. Sarah, dressed in a simple yet poised outfit, arrived with Celia by her side, brandishing a folder of evidence. Despite her nervousness, her posture was tall and her resolve unshaken. She looked out at the crowd, some holding signs reading "Accessibility is a right" and "Serve all customers." For the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone in this fight. Chris arrived moments later, sporting a subdued dark suit and no cap. The time for secrecy was over. The press recognized him instantly. Microphones were thrust into his face. "Mr. Hemsworth, why are you involved in this case? Is this a political statement or personal conviction?" He calmly responded. "I'm here to support a friend who was discriminated against." It's as simple as that. Then he politely waved off more questions and slipped past the reporters to join Celia and Sarah on the courthouse steps. Inside, the formal hearing room was abuzz. On one side sat the Brew and Bliss legal team, including the newly embattled CEO, Michaela, looking uncharacteristically tense. Next to her was a different lawyer than before, presumably brought in to handle the crisis. On the other side, Sarah, Celia, and Chris took their seats. A judge at a raised bench presided over the proceedings, flanked by officials from the Commission on Human Rights. The hearing began with opening statements. Celia explained how Sarah had been refused service due to her deafness, highlighting the store's internal documents that promoted discriminatory practices in the name of speed. She promised to show evidence that Brew and Bliss management knowingly encouraged staff to alienate customers requiring accommodations. The opposing lawyer shot back that these documents were taken out of context, that the corporation never intended to discriminate, and that the employees in question had misinterpreted company guidelines. Michaela nodded vigorously, as if repeating the same tired line would make it more believable. Then came witness testimonies. Sarah was first, recounting her personal experience through written notes that Celia read aloud, with occasional sign interpretation from an official interpreter. The room fell silent as Sarah's humiliating ordeal came to life in stark detail. She described the manager's refusal, the barista's scorn, and the heartbreak of being cast aside. A wave of empathy spread through those gathered. Even some of Brew and Bliss's staff present wore conflicted expressions, as if seeing the raw truth for the first time. Next, Chris was called. He strode to the stand, every eye in the room on him. He introduced himself. "My name is Chris Hemsworth," stirring mild murmurs. Then he described exactly what he had witnessed that morning. The barista's refusal to accept Sarah's note, the manager's scolding, the threatening posture of the security guard. Chris spoke calmly, but with conviction. His voice carried emotional weight. He wasn't reciting lines, he was sharing a genuine moral stance. He ended by saying, "I stepped in because it was wrong. Any decent human being would have done the same." The Brew and Bliss attorney tried to question his motives, implying he might be using this for publicity. Chris remained unshaken. "I gain nothing by being here," he replied firmly. "If anything, I risk a great deal of unwanted attention." But Sarah deserves justice. That closed the line of questioning. Then came the day's biggest surprise witness, Trish, the manager herself. She walked in with trembling hands, flanked by her own counsel. Brew and Bliss's legal team hadn't expected her to show. She had turned her back on them, outraged at being scapegoated. The hush in the room was electric. The moment she was sworn in, her eyes flickered with a mixture of guilt and defiance. She admitted to refusing Sarah's service, but insisted she'd done so under pressure from corporate. She revealed the email chain, the memos from top management, everything that spelled out, in black and white, how staff were being told to handle time-consuming customers. She recounted weekly calls in which managers were scolded for slow throughput, told to encourage less demanding customers, or stifle complicated orders. Brew and Bliss's lawyer jumped up, objecting, claiming Trish was disgruntled and untrustworthy. But Celia calmly produced the same documents, verifying them with metadata. The cat was out of the bag. The hearing room buzzed as the commission officials conferred, flipping through pages of evidence. Michaela shifted in her seat, her expression betraying the sinking realization that this would not be contained. The final part of the hearing involved direct questioning of CEO Michaela Porter. She was forced to confront the incriminating memos. Voice quavering, she tried to distance herself. Yes, those communications came from somewhere in our operational team, but it was never my intention to discriminate against deaf customers. We were simply trying to streamline service, she said, repeatedly insisting her words were misunderstood. A commission official, an older gentleman with years of experience in civil rights issues, eyed her with clear disapproval. Your misunderstanding has caused undue harm, he said pointedly, and it seems systematic. By the day's end, Brew and Bliss found itself at a precarious juncture. The commission had enough to move forward with fines and possibly further legal action. The press outside smelled blood in the water. Michaela's attempts at damage control, last-minute apologies or half-hearted statements carried little weight in the face of the documented policy. The hearing adjourned with a promise from the commission to issue a formal ruling within a few weeks. Sarah, physically and emotionally drained, stepped out into the crisp air, Chris at her side. Journalists clamored for interviews, but the pair wove through them, only pausing when Sarah decided, in a courageous moment, to address the crowd. She lifted a small whiteboard she'd brought along, writing with a marker. This is about basic human dignity. Everyone deserves to order a cup of coffee without fear. Chris read it aloud for the cameras, and the crowd erupted in applause. Sarah's face glowed with a quiet triumph. In that instant, Chris realized how far she'd come, from a lone woman, humiliated at a cafe counter, to a powerful voice for change, standing tall on the courthouse steps. And though it had required a painful confrontation, the truth was finally out. Brew and Bliss could no longer hide behind corporate jargon. Victory was at hand, but not sealed just yet. The commission's ruling would formalize the consequences Brew and Bliss had to face, likely forcing a settlement with Sarah, mandatory staff training, and a public apology. Their entire business model might be forced to change. Observers whispered that Michaela Porter's days as CEO were numbered. Yet Sarah and Chris both felt a profound sense of accomplishment and relief. They shared a quiet hug on the steps, cameras still flashing around them. She mouthed the words "thank you," and he responded with a gentle nod. Their fight had lit a fire of awareness that wouldn't soon be extinguished. And that in itself was the real victory. 3 weeks later, the Commission on Human Rights released its official ruling. Brew and Bliss was found in violation of city and federal anti-discrimination statutes. They were fined heavily and mandated to initiate comprehensive training programs for every staff member on accommodating deaf and disabled customers. They were required to issue a public statement apologizing to Sarah Hastings specifically, as well as to the broader deaf community. Within days, Michaela Porter resigned as CEO under mounting investor pressure, replaced by an interim leader who pledged to overhaul the toxic culture. Sarah received a personal written apology from the board of directors. More importantly, the chain agreed to implement sign language-friendly touchscreen kiosks and to expand accessibility options across all their locations. The resolution included a confidentiality clause regarding the exact settlement amounts, but Sarah had insisted on ensuring her primary demand: structural change. News outlets covered the final developments, praising the outcome as a step forward for disability rights. Sarah, for her part, accepted the resolution with a mixture of relief and lingering hurt from the ordeal. She knew progress wasn't a magic wand. There was still a world that often overlooked people like her. Yet she felt that her courage, combined with Chris's unwavering support, had made a difference. The final day of the settlement saw the two of them, along with Celia, meeting at a newly reformed Brew and Bliss location. Sarah ordered a vanilla latte using the new kiosk, free of hassle, and the barista served her with a genuine smile. As for Chris, he quietly made a hefty donation to a nonprofit dedicated to deaf education. He never advertised it, never called a press conference. He simply wanted to help. His involvement in the case had been public enough, and he didn't wish to shift attention away from Sarah's victory. Before leaving New York to resume his acting commitments, he handed Sarah a parting gift, a voucher that paid for a sign language instructor to train Brew and Bliss employees, covering additional hours the chain might not fully fund. She was speechless and grateful. In the weeks that followed, Chris stayed in touch via email, occasionally video calling with Sarah. She'd use live captioning software on her phone so they could converse more naturally. Their bond had become a testament to empathy transcending celebrity status and personal barriers. Sarah continued to share her story at deaf community events, advocating for broader acceptance. Brew and Bliss, under new leadership, seemed determined to rehabilitate its image. And while cynics scoffed that it was just good PR, those who followed Sarah's journey believed in the genuine possibility of change. Days turned into months, and the city buzzed on as it always did. But for everyone who had watched the Brew and Bliss saga unfold, whether on social media, in person, or in the news, an important message echoed: dignity belongs to everyone. And sometimes, it just takes one courageous stand, one bold tip, one unwavering witness to spark the transformation that a community needs. If you found Sarah's journey inspiring and want to stay updated on similar stories that shine a light on truth, justice, and the power of everyday heroes, be sure to subscribe. Together, we can keep the conversation going and ensure no one is left without a voice at the counter or anywhere else.